Hello and happy Thursday evening. It's just about 5 minutes after the 8 o'clock, so we will just make a start at this point. Let me just share my screen on a student version of the view, what you would see on Canvas for our learning modules. And if we scroll down to this week's material, which is going to be a little way down since we are now approaching end of the course, we're now at week 13. So we're going to be looking at the digestive system. As usual with our learning modules, you'll find full lecture videos on this module covering all of the material that relates to the chapter material in quite a bit of detail. I've sectioned that into 3 parts, looking at some of the introductory general concepts, movement times, layers of the digestive tract. On the second section, looking at the first part of the structures, oral cavity, pharynx, esophagus, stomach, and the final part focusing on small and large intestines, and then liver, gallbladder, and pancreas. In addition, you will find under the lecture and notes a link to the digestive anatomy video, which revises the key points of the anatomy component of this chapter. What I'm asking you to complete this week is, as you are used to seeing, a digestive tract quiz. So a quiz for this chapter. Remember that this quiz is not intended in a way that you should have all and every answer that you would know when you start working on it. Quite the opposite. The digestive quiz is designed that it's kind of a part of the learning process. So as you are working through the digestive quiz, you will run into questions, some of the questions that you might not know answers to. And whenever you don't know an answer to, that's the time when you click on that link on the quiz that takes you to the electronic textbook that we use on this course and to the very specific part of the electronic textbook where that concept is covered. So it's kind of guided reading activity, allowing you to make sure that you get a chance to work through the textbook, knowing where the emphasis lies. So like I said, do approach the digestive quiz as a chance to revise the chapter material. So that's my encouragement for you in terms of how to tackle it. The second piece of homework is our digestive anatomy practice. Again, you've seen these anatomy practice assignments. They build heavily on these digestive anatomy videos or anatomy videos of the chapter where all of the key anatomical portions of that system are reviewed, and then you get to apply that knowledge on this practice of the anatomy. So I'm asking you to work through both of those. The final element of this week's assignments that we completed in class is the digestive case studies. And in this activity, we look through 4 different case scenarios that relate to the digestive system. And as you're working through those, you're presented to the multitude of things that relate to the digestive system in a clinical sense, and you'll get to learn a little bit of new material, do a little bit of research, and summarize that through answering, I believe it's 3 questions per each case scenario. So it's a really fun activity to work through. So for our today's material on this review session, unless I get questions popping up from the audience, my idea was really that we spend a little bit of time just reviewing the key points of the chapter material. And of course, I am not going to go into a great detail. This is simply kind of giving you an idea of the most important concepts, kind of an overarching high-level view of this system. Then, once we have done that, we will shift our attention to the lab for this week. So this serves as a purpose kind of to revisit some of those lab questions if you missed those or were not able to come to the class to attend to that. So this provides a great chance to kind of tackle those as well. So what I'm going to do at this point, I'm going to share my screen again, but this time we're going to look at a presentation. And this presentation, like I said, is really, really, really overarching general level review. On this general level review, we simply look at some of the important terminology that I want you to be familiar as it relates to the core concepts. And after that, we'll walk our way through different parts of the digestive tract, kind of reviewing the anatomy and physiology hand in hand, and in this way forming a kind of a complete overall understanding of the system. There's gonna be, in the interest of time, only the key points that we're gonna highlight. The full story, I encourage you for that to refer to the actual lecture videos. I will link as many of those lecture videos as I can to the end of this video, and the remaining ones you'll find on the Canvas course. So with that all being said, I want to start with two sets of two important terms that I want to make sure that we all know. So the first term that I want to discuss about is the term digestion. So when we're talking about digestive tract, we have to remember the digestive tract really is nothing but one continuous tube. It starts at the level of the mouth, ends at the other end, and at certain parts that tube then expands wider, certain parts it gets narrower. There might be various sphincters that control what moves through the tube at what time. There's going to be a lot of secretions that we're adding to the contents of that tube, and there's also going to be times when we are removing, taking into the body material from that tube. But if you really look technically, that tube, since it is a continuous tube starting from mouth, ending at other end, even though you take food into the mouth, swallow it, it travels through stomach and other intestines and then comes out, it technically is never really inside your body. To classify as being inside your body, it would need to cross from that tube to the tissues inside the body. So that's going to be the key concept to keep in mind as we revise these two terms, digestion and absorption. So for the absorption to happen, digestion needs to take place first. And what we're talking about digestion when we talk about is that we take these large macromolecules that are essentially the things that you eat. It could be carbs, it could be lipids, it could be proteins, but large molecules. And as we start to process these large molecules in our digestive tract, we slowly start breaking them smaller and smaller and into smaller pieces. And every time we break a large molecule into smaller components, we are going to be doing catabolic reactions. And you might remember from your BIO201 that catabolic reactions refer to breaking a large molecule into small elements, and as a byproduct of that, or as an important product of that, we end up releasing energy. So that's what we do when we break apart the food that we consume. We release energy, and it's this energy that we use to drive the processes within the body. So digestion really refers to the process of breaking large molecules into smaller components and releasing energy in this process. Now, we are left with these smaller molecules. Now that they are small enough molecules, they're small enough that they can actually do that job of crossing the membranes from the tube inside the body to actually being inside the body. So we're crossing those membranes that actually take these small molecules to our cardiovascular system, sometimes to our lymphatic system, if we're talking, for example, of large dietary fat molecules, and so on. And then we can start using actually those small molecules that we took out of that. So that's the important concept with the absorption, that absorption refers to now to these small molecules crossing that boundary. And without digestion having happened first, absorption probably would not happen for the large molecules. So we need to do digestion in order to enable us to do the absorption. So those were the two terms that we needed to have a look. And pardon me, I've got one very lonely kitty who wants to be part of this desperately. So those two concepts, make sure that you know the difference and between digestion and absorption. The next thing that I want to talk about refers to the two types of movement that we see in the digestive tract. And we've seen some of these movements in other systems as well, for example, in the urinary system, but let's review them now in a greater detail. When we're discussing of these movements, we're going to be thinking of a muscular tube that we have here. And this muscular tube, the walls of it have a muscle layer, and this muscle layer allows us to do two types of things. And the first type of thing that we can do with this muscle tube is known as something called peristalsis. In peristalsis, the muscles that surround this tube start contracting in a very synchronized manner, so that when one muscle band has contracted, another one immediately next to it will contract. And this process continues. So in a sense, we're generating a wave-like movement throughout the length of this muscle tube. And as the muscle bands contract, they push the material in that tube onwards, and this happens with each contraction. So we're really moving the material along that muscular tube in this wave-like manner, if you wish. We see peristalsis, for example, in esophagus. So moving the materials from the mouth to the stomach. And often students tend to think that, oh, that's simply due to the gravity. Yes, gravity helps us that. But if you've ever tried to stand on your head and drink water at the same time, you'll notice that that water travels from your mouth to your stomach, even against the gravity. And this is an example of how peristalsis work, and you can really feel it if you give it a go. So I encourage you to have a look of that if you're curious of that. We saw other examples, for example, transporting urine from the kidneys to the urinary bladder. So this is where, again, we see a muscular tube that can do peristalsis taking place. So these processes happen regardless of your body orientation. For example, think of our astronauts being in the space with zero gravity. You would still be transporting materials from one place to another place in the direction it should go because of these muscular tubes contracting in this meaningful manner that generates the wave-like movement. Now, having said that, let's have a look of a second type of thing that can happen in these muscular tubes. This is known as segmentation. And segmentation really is what the name proposes. It's breaking the tube into segments here and there. It's not going to be as controlled in terms of generating this wave-like movement. It just happens at certain places, more you could think of at random. And as the tube contracts, there's few things that allows us to do. So first of all, it allows us to control that material stay on the respective sides. In addition, whatever gets contracted, that gets squashed a little bit. So there might be some physical, mechanical breaking down. And most importantly, as you contract, a little material moves away, and then as it relaxes, it moves back. So you're getting a little bit of mixing immediately around that part where the contraction happens. But overall, there's not going to be a net movement of the material. It's simply mixing and breaking down that we're seeing taking place in segmentation. The next thing that I want to spend a little bit of time to talk about is actually what do we call the material that's passing along in the digestive tract. And that varies depending on where in the digestive tube we are at. So it all starts with the food. Obviously, food is the material that you eat. As the food enters to the mouth, it now starts to get processed, mechanically broken down in the process of mastication. So chewing. In addition, in this process, we're adding saliva now to this mechanically broken material. This mixture of saliva and mechanically broken food is now called bolus. So bolus is often this kind of a more moist, kind of a little bit of a manageable ball-like structure of what used to be food. That's easier and more manageable for us to swallow, kind of stays nicely together. So that's our bolus. When bolus reaches the stomach and gets mixed with the secretions within the stomach, it stops being called bolus and it now becomes chyme. Chyme has much more a liquidy appearance, I guess, than the bolus. So not only we're adding with the stomach secretions a lot of chemicals that contribute, the entire texture, if you wish, of the substance changes. If you've ever had to throw up, you would have an idea what the chyme could be like in terms of the presence of that. Finally, chyme leaves stomach, travels through small intestines to the large intestines, where now, remember from our last chapter where we looked at the water balance in the body, one of the big things that we want to ensure is that we don't end up removing a lot of that water from our body through the process of eliminating the leftover material. If we did that, that would be an example of what happens in diarrhea. And diarrhea is a big killer because people become fast dehydrated. And think of especially not us here in the Western world, but people and situations where these individuals don't have a chance to replenish that lost fluid. So large intestines, its function of the large intestines is to recover a lot of that water from the material that initially is chyme. What's left when a lot of the water is recovered, and remember, electrolytes always followed the water, and also the other way around, where electrolytes went, water went. So water and electrolytes are removed now from this chyme, and what's left is the indigestible material that really we cannot use, but it's going to be fairly dry. This material is now known as feces, and it is the feces that we eliminate at the end of the large intestines. So I hope that those terms and those concepts make sense. I think they're important for us to have a shared language and be very clear what we're talking about. And having said that, I think the next thing for us to do is to look at the entire digestive tract as a review, go through the different parts and what happens at the different parts. And if I would go through this, I would typically draw with my students something that resembles something like this. Obviously, it's not to the scale. Obviously, it's not a perfect draft, but it highlights some of the key points. So we're seeing mouth at the one end, and then we're seeing the anus at the other end. And we'll see that everything in between is one continuous tube. That tube gets larger at certain parts, such as at the stomach. It gets thinner at other parts. I think the small intestines are a good example of that. And eventually ends with an opening at the other end. In addition to the continuous tube, we're going to see certain accessory glands that we will talk about in just a little bit. The big thing to take away from this graph, I think, is that all of this digestive tract shares a lot of the parts and shares a lot of the similar structure regardless where in this tract we are. So we remember we saw those 4 layers of general model of the digestive tract. Well, we're going to start at the level of the mouth. You remember lips formed the anterior boundary for the mouth. We had our teeth. We started with 20 primary teeth, the baby teeth that then got replaced by secondary teeth, the permanent teeth, I believe 32 of those. And we discussed how there were 4 main different types, and they all served a little bit of different purposes depending on what we were eating, whether it was for what type of food, what type of processing of that. But what happens at the level of the mouth is the mechanical breakdown of the food. In addition to that, you remember the floor of the mouth was formed by a tongue, a group of multiple muscle fibers doing multiple different things. Some more focused on the location of the tongue, some more focused on the shape of the tongue. Tongue plays an important role not only as a sensory organ, but moving and manipulating that food that gets processed at the level of the mouth. And once it's ready to be swallowed, for moving it also to the back of the mouth. We also saw that superiorly, the roof of the mouth was formed by palate. More anteriorly, we had hard palate where there was a bone inside, and more posteriorly at the back, we had soft palate, no bone in there. And at the very end from the soft palate hanging our uvula. Uvula again kind of plays an important role jumping up when we actually initiate the process of swallowing. But before swallowing takes place, we had 3 important extrinsic salivary glands that we wanted to talk about. Let's start with our parotid salivary gland. Parotid salivary gland is located next to the ear, kind of where your cheek would be. Actually, your facial nerve runs through there. I often think of the parotid salivary gland as a pirate having a parrot sitting on their shoulder. Where that parrot would be is a good clue where the parotid salivary gland will be. Parotid salivary gland on each side will have a duct that opens on the next to the upper second molar. And the secretion that comes out from the parotid salivary gland is going to be very watery, liquidy in terms of the texture of it. The second salivary gland that I wanted to talk about is going to be our submandibular salivary gland. Submandibular salivary gland has a duct that opens at the base of the lingual frenulum. So you remember the connective tissue band at the bottom of the tongue. Right at the base of it, there were 2 openings, one for each side for the submandibular salivary glands duct to open. So that's why learning these anatomical landmarks is going to be important. The secretion from submandibular salivary gland is kind of a mixture of serous, kind of watery, and mucus, kind of a thicker secretion. Final salivary gland that I want to discuss is going to be our sublingual salivary gland. Sublingual salivary gland has multiple ducts that open next to the tongue, and the secretions from here are going to be very mucus thick material. So all of these salivary glands contribute by adding some of the first things that start this digestive process. So you remember saliva contained, for example, salivary amylase, which played an important role in breaking down the starches. So really you could say that digestion starts even before the food enters to the mouth, simply by the sight, thought, or smell of the food that triggers our salivary glands to release saliva. Well, then the swallowing happens. And remember, swallowing, even though it starts as a voluntary process, it turns into involuntary process. So you're not able to stop the process of swallowing. The proper term would be deglutition once that starts. We had a look of our oesophagus, and you remember oesophagus was a muscular tube. And this muscular tube did very little other than helping us to transport the food from one part to another part. So there was very little digestion or absorption taking place there. It was simply for us to transport material from the mouth to the stomach. The muscular tube of the oesophagus helped us to do peristalsis, so transport the food to the stomach. Interesting thing about the oesophagus is that that's one of the few structures that actually punctures the diaphragm that separates the thoracic and abdominal cavities, that thin sheet of skeletal muscle that played so important role in respiration. Other than oesophagus, we're going to see abdominal aorta, inferior vena cava going through that, but it is the oesophagus that's a worthwhile structure to notice that goes through it. Well, immediately at the end of the oesophagus, we're going to see our stomach. And we're going to revise the few different parts of the stomach to start with. So the part immediately around where the oesophagus enters is going to be our cardia of the stomach. Notice that where the oesophagus joins to the stomach is going to be a little lower than the very tip of the stomach. This tip is known as a fundus of the stomach. And that's worth to know because that's where typically gases end up building. Then we're of course going to have also the body of the stomach, so the largest part of the stomach. And finally, at the more distal end towards the small intestines, we're going to have our pylorus, if you want to be specific, pyloric antrum and pyloric canal that then end the stomach, and then it turns into small intestines. Having said all that, we're going to also see two types of curves there. So the outer curve, the more lateral curvature, is going to be our greater curvature, and we're going to have a lesser curvature, the more medial, the smaller curvature of the stomach. In addition to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the two sphincters that we're going to see with the stomach. Where the oesophagus joins to the stomach cardia, there's going to be lower oesophageal sphincter. This is not really an anatomical sphincter, so we don't really necessarily see much if we dissect there, but it's definitely a physiological sphincter. And what it does, it makes sure that this part where the stomach and oesophagus joins is closed so that the stomach acids can't climb up to the oesophagus and cause irritation. If this were to happen, this is what we know as a heartburn, as the stomach acids irritate the esophageal wall lining. Of course, if you don't treat that and you have a lot of this stomach acid reflux to the esophagus, that can eventually cause ulcers in the esophagus. If you still don't treat it, prolonged heavy exposure of esophageal ulcers to stomach acids does increase the cancer risk on this area as well. So what the heartburn medications actually do, a lot of the time, they do simply focus on neutralizing the pH of the material, which in this case would be very acidic, that climbs to the esophagus. So we're hoping that that helps us to reduce that irritation and ulcer formation and so on. Well, the other sphincter that I wanted to talk about is the sphincter that separates the pylorus of the stomach from the small intestines. That's known as our pyloric sphincter. And pyloric sphincter controls how much and when do we let material move on from the stomach to the small intestines. Another thing that I do want to mention about the stomach is that you remember there were two types of muscle fibers that we found throughout the muscular layer of the digestive tract. And these were our more inner circular fibers and more outer longitudinal fibers. Well, stomach is a bit of an oddity because we're going to see a third type of muscle fibers within there. And these are going to be our oblique fibers. Remember, oblique meant that it was a direction that doesn't align with our traditional body planes. So with the X, Y, Z axis, if you think mathematical coordination or coordinates, the oblique fibers were kind of in a plane that didn't fit into that. So we see that third layer because that's the stomach's function to mix the contents and all that. Remember that stomach, because the contents were very acidic there, we actually, and there is not a lot of villi or other projections, though the surface area is not great at the stomach. Actually, a lot of digestive processes do not take place at the stomach. It's too acidic for a lot of the enzymes and other materials to work optimally, even though these would be present at the stomach. Other thing to remember from the stomach was that we had rugae. These were the folds inside. Those were to ensure that the stomach could extend and shrink as needed, respond to the need of that. So moving on from the stomach to the small intestines, we're going to have duodenum, the first about 25 centimeters, curving around where the pancreas will be, and then turning into jejunum. Jejunum continues until it turns into ileum, and small intestines tend to be at the central part of the abdominal cavity, kind of framed around by the large intestines. Where jejunum ends and ileum starts is not always obvious. It's not really a distinct place. It's just a transition. For remembering the three parts, duodenum, jejunum, and ileum, I propose that the mnemonic DJ ill, this jockey that plays really sick music, might be one way to tackle it. What's important to notice about small intestines is that as soon as this very acidic content from the stomach, that includes also the food matter that we've got there, leaves the stomach, we're going to start pumping into that material, including material known as pancreatic juice, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But this material largely neutralizes the acidity of the stomach secretions. And now that it's more neutral, a lot of these enzymes, a lot of the digestive processes start working more optimally. And it turns out that the small intestines is really the main site of absorption of the materials for that reason. So not in the stomach, but at the small intestines is where a lot of the absorption happens. Remember, there's going to be a rich blood supply to this area so that we can catch all of the energy and we can catch all of the nutrients that now get absorbed within this area of the small intestines. And we catch those with the bloodstream. Most of that bloodstream gets directed immediately to the liver, and one of the functions of the liver is to store the energy from this blood so that it can be recruited and released when needed. Otherwise, body tissues seem to be a little bit of short-sighted. They would just go ahead and burn off that energy and not think of when it might really be needed. So liver is an important structure in storing that energy that gets collected with the blood and blood supply from the small intestines. Well, once we get to the end of the small intestines and the last part being ileum, we get to the large intestines. The first part of large intestines is going to be known as cecum. So the transition point between small intestines and large intestines is going to be named after these two structures as ileocecal opening. From cecum, we can also see appendix. You remember we talked about that structure earlier on our course, and we noticed how appendix can get inflamed, and if that's the case, and if that's a problem and concern, we can actually remove it from you in a surgery. So you can live perfectly fine without appendix. We also speculated different theories for the reason why we have appendix. I think we settled on that the most plausible explanation at the moment that we have available is that it's an evolutionary remnant when we were eating diet that housed a lot more plant-based materials. So there has the bacteria that's ideal for digesting that was housed there. After the cecum in the large intestines, we actually move on to colon. And colon has few distinct parts. So on the right-hand side, moving from cecum to the superior portion of the right-hand side, we're going to see our ascending colon. Then crossing from the right-hand side to the left-hand side is going to be our transverse colon. And finally, on the left-hand side, coming from the superior portion to the inferior portion, is going to be our descending colon. The final part of the colon is known as sigmoid colon. You can probably see a little bit of an S-shaped shape for there if you have a good imagination, like I certainly have. And that then opens to the rectum and anus. The main function of the large intestines was, as we discussed, to recover the water, reabsorb the water at this level, so that we don't end up losing too much water with the feces. It is the large intestines that takes back the water and electrolytes at this part of the digestive tract. So that's the tube part. We still need to add 3 different parts to this discussion. We saw liver earlier on, and of course liver has so many functions, anything from detoxification to energy storage, processing old red blood cells, and so on. For our purposes on this chapter, we're going to focus on the role of the liver in producing bile. So liver produces bile, and that bile gets stored in gallbladder. So gallbladder's role is to store and concentrate that bile. Sometimes this concentration is too extreme, so we can end up forming gallstones, and that would be then a problem. But normally that's not an issue. So what the bile does is that when you eat a food or a meal that's heavy in fats and it reaches the small intestines, the bile is released to the first part of the small intestines, to the duodenum, through the same opening where the pancreatic secretions are released. So we call it hepatopancreatic opening. And that bile helps then to process those fatty macromolecules, so that gets then done and dealt with. For this reason, an individual who has had their gallbladder removed probably is not going to be super eager to have a really big, heavy, fatty meal, because they're not able to process it because we don't have that bile being produced. The final structure that I want to discuss is going to be our pancreas. And when we discussed the endocrine function, we saw that pancreas played an important role in regulating the blood sugar through glucagon and insulin. We're not going to be interested at this chapter on the endocrine function, but we're going to focus on the exocrine function. And the exocrine function of the pancreas is to produce pancreatic juice. And what pancreatic juice is, it's the most complete digestive secretion that we're going to see. So it helps with a lot of the digestion so that absorption can take place in the small intestines. You also might want to notice that the pancreatic juice is released through that hepatopancreatic opening to the duodenum, and it plays an important role in what I mentioned before of neutralizing the pH of these acidic secretions, acidic mixture of chyme that leaves the stomach. And as it neutralizes this, now the digestive processes are much more successful and able to function, and now absorption starts to happen, especially at the small intestines. So that's really it. That's a quick overall kind of a summary level review of the digestive tract. And I hope that you found it useful to have just a general appreciation of what happens there. So now let me just jump out from this PowerPoint. And what I want to do next is the last part of our session today. And this last part is going to be that we are going to look at the lab together a little bit, just to make sure that if you missed the class, you have all the tools and resources available to complete the lab. We will go through it fairly quick, so if you have questions, feel free to reach out to me. There is an element of independent research that I'm expecting with the lab, especially if you weren't in the class. And of course, you can always come back to this recording. So, like I said, in the lab for the digestive system, we're going to be looking at 4 different case studies. So we're going to go through those together and kind of formulate a little bit of an idea of what's going on. In the first case study, we're going to have a 21-year-old student called Sarah who went to spend Thanksgiving Day with her relatives and her grandparents. And when she was coming back after the Thanksgiving, all of a sudden she had vision issues and she had to pull to the side of the road, and this just kept getting worse. She had highway patrol officer who pulled over and spoke to Sarah, and at this time Sarah was actually having trouble even swallowing or speaking clearly, so there was clearly something happening. The officer helped Sarah to get to the emergency room, and there, after some work, what we found out was that during the last 24 hours, Sarah had consumed some vegetables that her grandmother had canned. We see that the situation gets progressively worse. Sarah's breathing becomes more difficult. We do blood analysis, get the GI tract pumped empty, and are prepared that Sarah might need to go into mechanical respirator. Not a pleasant experience if one ends up having to need that. The diagnosis that we come up with is that it's likely to be botulism, and we asked Sarah's parents to save some of the contents of the Thanksgiving meal, especially the canned vegetables, and send them for analysis. So that's the scenario 1. Let's have a look at what we can make out of that. We have 3 different question groups that we're going to tackle, and we're going to start by addressing what is botulism. So botulism is a form of poisoning caused by toxins of a bacteria, and this is common that this can happen if we have followed improper procedures when canning vegetables that really generates that ideal conditions for those bacteria to grow in. Some of the symptoms, they can vary in severity, but it's going to be the nervous system and muscular system that are impacted, and it can be just slight impacts such as issues with swallowing or speaking, or it can be really devastating and affect the breathing muscles, which obviously would not be great. In terms of the treatment can include, of course, antitoxin against the bacteria, botulinum, and we can, if we are worried about the breathing, provide additional oxygen so that the oxygen supply is not compromised, or if we worry about those respiratory muscles not being able to keep going, doing their job, a ventilator might be one of the options, obviously depending on the need and not something that we immediately want to jump into. The good news is that the mortality rate with the foodborne botulism is fairly low, somewhere around 5 to 10%. Botulism can affect muscle control also of the respiratory muscles, like I mentioned, and that would be devastating if that would cause a failure in breathing in this case. So that was the first scenario. What I want to do is look at the second scenario, which is a little different situation, different clinical condition that we'll see. In this case, we're looking of a couple, 25 years old couple who get their first child. The mother is very healthy during the pregnancy, and baby is born. Delivery went fairly smoothly. About 2 days later, they go home and they start to notice that the baby's eyes seem slightly yellow, and this condition keeps worsening, and they take the newborn to the ER, and we end up diagnosing neonatal jaundice. This is a fairly common condition on newborns, and we're lucky to say that it's not going to cause too much of a drama. We want to follow up and monitor the blood bilirubin concentration and make sure that the baby is fine, but keep an eye on that, and just be aware that neonatal jaundice is probably what's happening. We don't want things to get worse. Normally, there is a great improvement of the condition over time. So let's have a look at the questions that we had for this scenario. Jaundice is this yellowing of the skin due to the buildup of bilirubin in the blood, and that is a result of liver not being able to efficiently process the breakdown of red blood cells. One of the treatments that's recommended for newborn jaundice is light therapy. The explanation, really, we kind of already had a quick look of that. Infant jaundice occurs because the liver is not really ready enough to get rid of that bilirubin in the bloodstream, and then the bilirubin builds up in the blood and causes that yellowing of the skin. Newborns without jaundice, in those cases, the liver should be, it is successful of properly breaking down the bilirubin from red blood cells, and this yellow pigment does not accumulate. So if we're not able to do that, then we end up seeing the case of neonatal jaundice. The third scenario that I wanted to discuss about is a little different again, and let's have a look of that. Now we have 58-year-old gentleman Harold who wakes up in the middle of the night with abdominal pains. This is happening several nights a week. Also experiencing discomfort during the afternoon. Pain becomes so severe that Harold comes and sees us at the ER, and we do our consultation and notice that Harold's appetite has suffered as a result of this pain, and he's really worried that maybe it's what he eats that's causing this. Harold does seem fairly well in other aspects, and we refer Harold to an endoscopy. With the endoscopy, we end up finding that there is something going on with the lining of the esophagus or stomach. We can even collect little samples in that process for lab analysis. So let's have a look at the questions for this scenario. And we're going to start with peptic ulcer, which is the case and diagnosis that we end up here. We're talking of a sore or inflammation of the stomach or esophagus lining. This is because of the hydrochloric acid, so stomach acid, that damages the digestive tract lining. Often this is triggered by a bacteria, H. pylori. Common treatments would include, first of all, antacids to neutralize the stomach contents so they don't irritate that lining as much, and also antibiotics to deal with this bacteria. Body's natural protection about peptic ulcers, there's a lot to go there. So the cell arrangement, the fast regeneration of epithelial cells within a range of days, and also the mucus lining that protects these surfaces from the stomach lining are some of the things that I've shared here. We go into more detail of this in the full lecture video where we discussed why stomach acids don't digest the stomach wall lining itself. Endoscopy, like I kind of already referred, is a long flexible tube with a camera at the end of it to use to see and have a look of what's going on the digestive tract. We can even use it to acquire small tissue samples if needed for further analysis. So that was our third case scenario, and we're ready to look at the fourth final case scenario, which is a little different. In this case, we've got a 26-year-old Asian graduate student who's been experiencing kind of occasional discomfort after consuming a meal. This got to the worst that it's been so far. About an hour after Pei had consumed a cheeseburger and a large chocolate milkshake. Pei ended up spending much of that night in pain, having abdominal cramps, diarrhea, feeling really sick to the stomach, and that triggered her to come to the ER. Based on the consultation, we seen that the discomfort seems to be associated with her dining out. This double cheeseburger and chocolate shake might be the culprits, we think. Most evenings, Pei does cook for herself, usually preparing very traditional Asian cuisine, and she rarely has any issues with that diet. We ask about the use of dairy products, and we find out that in her day-to-day life, where she cooks the Asian cuisine, she rarely uses dairy products. So let's have a look at questions for this scenario. We find out that Pei is lactose intolerant, so that refers to the inability to digest lactose, which is a sugar found in the milk products. This is caused, the lactose intolerance, when one is lacking lactase enzyme. Typically, the diagnosis would be through eliminating the milk products for a period of time from the diet, seeing if there's an improvement and drawing conclusions from that. We can do blood tests. We can do even breathing tests to kind of have a more formal diagnosis. How do you treat someone like that? Well, we've got basically two options. Either you just stop consuming the dairy products, and that might be a solution. If you still want to consume dairy products, other option is that you take that enzyme that contains lactase before you consume dairy, so you do end up having that enzyme to break down those sugars. The ethnicity was important in this case because it turns out that anywhere from 70 to almost up to 100% of people from East Asian background tend to be lactose intolerant. So lactose intolerance is one of those things that's very regionally dependent, depends on your ethnicity and the genetic characteristics that are common within that area. So I hope that you found those case studies as interesting and kind of as a chance to apply what you have learned about digestive tract in a new manner. And on that, we will kind of wrap up what we had about the digestive tract. And the final thing that I want to do is to make an announcement and kind of a reminder. And let's see if I can jump around on the screens again to our announcements. So please remember that your exam tree and practical tree results are now available for you to access on the Canvas. I've taken great care to give you individual feedback with quite a bit of detail. So hopefully you find that useful in terms of reviewing how you ended up with the scores that you ended up with. Next week, we're going to move on to have a look at first male reproductive system, and after that, we're going to discuss about female reproductive system. And those two chapters really wrap up the learning content of this course. I know we've covered a huge range of things during this semester. I know it's been very busy. I really appreciate all the hard work you have put on this class, and I look forward to being able to finish this class with the great scores that you so deserve in this class. As always, I am going to be available. We have these live online sessions. We meet in person. And of course, you can always reach out to me also through Canvas messaging. That's the preferred method. And we can have the dialogue in writing, or we can do one-on-one meeting, either in person or remotely. So my role is to be here to help you every step of the way. We're so close to the finish line, so let's make sure that you cross that and finish up strong. I really, really do appreciate you being part of this class. And as always, I will be sharing this review session also as a recording as soon as I finish processing it on the computer. Have a very good rest of the night. Have a very good rest of the week and enjoy your weekend. And I will be seeing most of you in person again next week, and we'll take it from there and make sure that we tackle the last few chapters with great success. Until then, thank you for joining me again, and have a good rest of your night.